Hey, this is Mike from INSYDIUM. In this video we're going to take a look at how to create a Flynit type effect using X particles. Let's have a look at the example. Okay, so you can see we've got the mesh being generated, we've got the strings coming down, splitting off and building the actual mesh effect. So this is what we're going to do, so let's get started. I've got a new scene and I've got a simple cloner. This is R18, so we're using the honeycomb array mode, and inside there is just a simple disk that's being converted into a mesh. So we've got a 6-sided hexagon. Now the shape can be anything you want. You can use a more custom knit looking shape. I'm just using this for a basic shape to get it started with. Let that be whatever you want it to be. And the next thing I've got is a material, and in the luminance channel I've just got a gradient that is animated going across the screen, so it sort of just builds this little white line that goes across. And what we want to do is we want that to go across this mesh. So what we'll do is we will convert this into an actual polygon object. So see on your keyboard, you're going to select everything, convert this into a single mesh, connect objects and delete. Okay, you can take that out. And what we want to do is use the texture as a particle emission source. Now if you've done that before using X particles, you'll know that it needs to be UV mapped, but the problem is if we drop this on, you see it's actually going on every single polygon, not across the whole surface. So what we need to do is we need to delete the UV tag we've got here. Actual material selected, we're going to right click, we're going to choose fit region, and we'll draw a region across the mesh. You can see it's now put it in the correct position that we want. However, the projection is set to flat. So what we also need to do is we need to right click and choose generate UV coordinates, and that now adds a new tag and changes the projection back to UV mapping. So we've got our animated texture going across the mesh and it's using UVs. So that's exactly what we want for the particle emissions. Okay, so let's get started with the particles. We're going to hide this because we don't need it anymore. X particles, we're going to get a new system, and we'll hide the icon, go to emitters, create a new emitter, and we'll call this one mesh. Okay, so let's go to object tab, change the emitter shape to object. Object is our disk. Let's call this mesh as well. We'll call it mesh base. And we're going to change it from emit from polygon center to texture. Drop our texture in the link and change the emit channel to luminance, since we've generated our texture in the luminance channel, and we'll set this to none. I'm just going to go to the display, change these to squares, and if we push play now, it's creating the particles across the mesh. Now they're moving and we don't want that, so we're going to go to emissions and we're going to set the speed to 0, and we're going to set an intersection because I don't want them to be lying on top of each other. So I'm going to set an intersection or no intersection and for radius of 1. And we might go up on that, we'll have a look, see how it looks. Okay, so it's creating the shape of the mesh. It doesn't look too bad actually. I think we'll stick with that for now. And we've got enough particles. We might increase that. Let's try 2000. So let's try again. And if I unhide it, you'll see that the particles are being born where our line is going across the actual mesh that we've animated previously. Okay, so that's looking okay. Let's hide the mesh again. And we'll go to our emitter display, and I'm going to enable display constraints because we're going to build constraints to connect these up to create our actual mesh object. So let's go to Dynamics, add constraints, enable connect at birth, and we want to keep our connection limit quite low, so let's try 4 for now, and our radius of about 5. Okay, so let's see how that works. So you can see it's connecting them up. Let's just go in a bit. And it's actually generating the shape now. You can see we're getting a lot of little connections, and you can change that by changing the connection limit and the radius. So it's not quite connecting as well as we want it to, so let's try 10 and a lower connection limit. Okay, so it's still getting a bit too choppy, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our emitter, and I'm going to increase a lot more particles. So that's 10,000. And let's get our constraints. I'm going to have a higher connection limit with a lower radius, so let's try 5 and 6. See how we get on with this. That looks better already. So I want it tighter so that the net weave is a lot tighter together, and we actually get the full shape. Okay, so that looks better. And you can change that just by the connection limit depending on how much you want connecting like this. But overall I'm happy with that for an actual shape. So what we do next is I'm going to go to the generators, choose trails, and drop the mesh emitter in there, and we'll call this one mesh as well, and we'll set the algorithm to constraints, and that's going to draw a mesh, draw a spline based on the actual constraints. So if we go to our emitter, we can turn off the display now, and we need to enable birth. So you can see we're getting an actual spline, so let's just color this up so we know what we're looking at. Okay, I'm just going to change our keyframes on the animation so that they're linear. Just go to Window, F Curves, Gradient, select them all, and then right click and choose Linear. I don't like how slow it is at the start, so I just want it to keep it constant speed going on. Cool. So we're now getting our weave built, but what we need is a leading edge of particles and our strings that come down from the weave to build it. So let's get the leading edge. So I'm going to control drag this emitter just to make a copy of it, call it leading edge. And everything's set how we want it to because it's copying the previous one. So I'm just going to change the color so that we see a different color in the particles. And we're going to go to the emissions and turn off no intersections and set this down. So let's try 1000 to start with. Change the lifespan to 0.1 so that we've just got a flickering amount of particles that just follow the edge of the build. Okay, so we need some more particles than that. So we'll leave it at 10,000. As you can see, it's just following that edge, and the previous ones are building the mesh behind it. Might even go 1 frame instead of 0.1. Okay, that's looking better. Let's change the display on this one so it's faster. And just go fast mode. Okay. Now with the mesh, let's get some deformation in there so that it's getting that sort of a wavy thing going on. You can see this one, the mesh is actually waving around. So what we'll do is we'll get a displace deformer and we'll put that under the mesh, go to shading, set that to noise, and let's turn everything off and unhide it so we can see what's going on. Go to the noise, set the scale to about 600, animation speed 1, just increase the strength. So if we animate that, you can see we're just getting that nice sort of undulating mesh going on. Go even higher than that. Okay, so that's working well. We can hide that again. Turn back on our particles. And now that it's moving, you can see that's made a bit of a mess. What we need to do with our particles is go to the emitter and make sure it sticks its source is on. And you can see it's now getting that animation as well. Right, so let's work on the strings coming in. What we're going to do is hide that again, unhide this, and I'm going to get a plane object, and we'll just enable wireframe view so we can see what we're looking at. I'm going to scale this right down, have it about the same width as the mesh, and I don't want any subdivisions in that axis and the width. Let's copy our displacer, drag it into here so we're getting the same amount of displacement, and I'm going to put this in a null, so Alt G just to group it. We'll call this connector A. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to animate it going across the screen at the same speed as the actual line, which starts at frame 5. So add a keyframe, go up to 200, and we'll drag it across. So that just means it's generally following that, but we want it to be ahead of it, so we're going to go in and we animated the null but not the plane, so we can now set the plane to wherever we want it, and we want it slightly above and across from the line, and then angled it like so that it's going across. And because that is linear keyframed, we need to do the same thing, so we'll select that, go into our F curves with the connector and just set that to linear as well. So you can see it's always ahead of our line. Okay, and then we're going to go into our particles, and we're going to create a new emitter, set that to object, our plane is the object, and we'll call this plane A just to keep everything labeled nicely. Our emitter, we'll call this connector A as well. Display, let's go for circles, and we'll make these ones blue, give them a bit of a size just so that they stand out. And we'll go shot, object, and we're going to set it to stick source and 1 particle per source element, and it's at polygon center. So if we go back to frame 0, go up 1 frame, it's going to create a particle on each of those polygons. Okay, so that's what we want. We can hide this mesh from the viewport. Now what we want to do is connect these particles to the red leading edge particles, and the way to do that is to use the XP electrics. So go to the electrics, add that in, and we're going to set the mode to particle, and the emitter is the first emitter, connector A, and the destination emitter is the leading edge emitter. So it creates these crazy lines, and all we need to do is just turn everything down so that it's just a straight connection. And if we play that, you can see it's just going to create this connection between these particles which follow the leading edge and is drawing the previous particles on. Okay, so we can hide the base mesh again, and then what we want to do is create one more so that we have longer strings coming off, and then they hit this one and split, and you do the same thing. So let's get our connector, copy and paste it. We'll call this one B, and we can stick this one straight up in space. Now that might look too extreme, so let's lower this and lower this one. Okay, so then we're going to get a connector B particles, so copy that, B, change the display, and it's going to go from plane B. Let's go up 1 frame. So we've got these ones and we want to connect them to these ones. So let's copy our electrics. Let's just call this one A, this one B, and then it's going to go from connector B to connector A, like so. And that one's a bit more even. So we can do whatever we want with this one. You can have it animated as well. It doesn't really matter because they're just going to be off in space. And you can see it's hitting those ones and then creating the branching lines that are going into the leading edge. So what I want to do is make the actual deformation a lot stronger on these guys, just so it's looking a bit more extreme. Okay, so you can see we've got the foundations working now, and again this mesh can be anything. It could be this shoe or anything that you want to knit. You can see those connections aren't quite working, so we're going to have to look at that again. Let's just go back to our emitter, mesh, got enough particles. Okay, so we'll look at the constraints and increase the connection limit. Let's try 8. Yeah, that looks better. So it's creating all the mesh elements that we want it to, and you can see the edge is working well. It looks like it's building by these connections. Okay, so pretty much happy with that. I might increase it a little bit more. So let's try 10 by 10, and what we'll do now is just give these guys a color. So it's easier to see in the viewport, and then I'm going to quickly cache this whole scene. Okay, so we're all cached up. I can play it now in the viewport, so you can see we've got the mesh creating, we've got the leading edge, all our little splines working really well. We can hide our emitters, so don't need to see them anymore. And obviously you can spend a bit more time perfecting how this looks by working on the actual base geometry and also the constraint connections. But since it's just for the sake of this tutorial and we're working quickly, this is what we're going to end up with. And now we're going to look at rendering, and we're going to use cycles to render this because it'll be able to do a nice quick job of these as curves. So we'll right click the generators, choose a cycles 4D CY curve, and since each one's different we can change the thickness and what have you of that. We need a material, so cycles 4D object material, drop that on each of these, and we need some lights, so we'll go to cycles menu and let's add one light, and we'll set this to an area. Okay, so let's bring that up and just light this thing. So let's put one up above, and we'll copy this one, put it on the back edge, and then one more going underneath to light it from below. Don't need to worry too much about orientation, just make sure it's facing the right way, and then we'll be able to colour these once we're into rendering. Okay, so let's just I'm going to go to a cycles layout, and I'm just going to go to the cycles menu, change it to multiple GPUs, set that right, and then get the real time on. So they're quite thick at the moment, and what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our cycles tags and start working on those just to get the right thickness for each part. So the trail is the base mesh, so we're going to select that, and at the moment we've got the start and end as 0 and 1, so we're going to set them both to be equal, and then we can just scale it down to be exactly how we want it to be. Zoom in. So I'm just going to put a slight dip in the center so that the ends are a little bit higher up, just to get a sort of a curve going on. Drop it all down. Yep, okay, so I'm happy with that. Let's look at these ones. So matrix A, set that again to 1, and what we want is we want it fairly thick up here because we want it to look like it's sort of splitting, so we'll do that, and then we want it to thin down towards the end. Let's put one in here. Something like that, and we can adjust these later. And again, the last one, let's just make it all a little bit thinner. So that's not too bad. Okay, so that's working well. Let's just get some color in there. This is our object material. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a gradient in there. So I'm going to use converter color ramp, and we'll choose a preset, something like this flame, so we've got a bit of color variation to drive the diffuse. So, and then we want to get some mapping in there, so we go vector, mapping, and we'll get the coordinates from input, texture coordinates generated. So now we're getting some color variation on the surface. Then we need a little bit of reflection in there as well, just to sort of get some flecky highlights. So we'll put a mix shader and a glossy, and we'll drop the mix down so it's only a tiny bit of glossy, and the glossy can be quite rough, and we'll also turn the roughness of the diffuse so you get really rough sort of surface that has a tiny little bit of fleck in it. And then let's add a little bit of bump using a noise, and that needs to go through a math multiply just to grayscale it up and give us a strength value. So go into displacement, and 0.5 should be enough for this. Okay, so that's looking good. Don't know about this color ramp though, so I might just see what else we've got. Have a play with your colors. We'll leave it at this for this one. Anything will go in there. And then lastly, we want some depth of field, so I'm just going to get a null object, and that's going to be our focus. So we can call that focus. We want a cycles camera, and drop the focus in the focus object link, and then we can go to the cycles tag and change the size of the radius to suit. So that plays to 6. So we've got a nice depth of field going on. Got the Flynit mesh building. So that's all working well. Then you could put a gradient in the background or something, or you can do that in post. Put a bit of bloom in post as well, just to color correct it and make it look nice. That's a general idea how to do a Flynit rig using X particles and then rendering with Cycles 4D.